Wonderful. So I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce you to Grace Lorden. She's been a colleague of mine for many years. We used to be located in the same building, which was fantastic, and cross paths regularly in the lift. Grace Lorden, Dr. Grace Lorden, is the founding director of the Inclusion Initiative, which I'm sure she's going to tell you more about later, and associate professor in the Department of Psychological and Behavioural Science at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Grace is an economist and a labour market skills expert. Her research focuses on inclusive leadership, women's progress in the workplace, the future of work, productivity through diversity, and individual success. And one of the reasons we're really excited to invite Grace to talk to you, not only because of the importance of her research, but because also for you to hear about the different ways, to hear from someone who has applied their research to the real world in a range of different ways. So Grace has been an expert advisor to the UK government, sitting on their Skills and Productivity Board. She's currently leading a significant £2 million ESRC-funded research project looking at diversity and productivity from education to work. Her academic writings have been published in top international journals, which you would expect from a leading academic, but she's also written for the media, for the Financial Times, Fast Company, Reuters, and so on. Grace is also a regular speaker and advisor to blue-chip finance and technology firms. So she's got a wonderful array of experience, skills, and expertise to share with you. She has recently published this wonderful book, Think Big, Take Small Steps and Build the Future You Want, which sounds incredibly empowering, and maybe we can all take away some important ideas about next steps for our future. So the plan is, in 2 seconds, or a little bit more, I'm going to hand over to Grace. She's going to present her keynote. She'll speak for about half an hour, and then we're going to open the floor up for questions. And we'll have 2 stewards with roving mics, and we'll take questions in groups of 3. So a big round of applause for Grace. Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much for that wonderful welcome, Claire. I work in the Psychological and Behavioural Science department, and I teach behavioural science. And one of the things that we talk about is managing expectations of people. So I always get nervous when you get such a nice introduction about whether or not I'm going to be able to deliver to the level, but I will give it a go. Today I'm going to talk to you about thinking big by thinking differently. And before I start my keynote that really relates to my book, Think Big, I want to kind of give you some idea about how I got here, because I know this is a conference on research. So my research began about 10 years ago in companies, where I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to make hiring, promotions, and growth decisions fair. So while a lot of my colleagues who work on inclusion focus on discrimination, I actually focus on favoritism. So thinking why people get jobs when they don't necessarily deserve them, and how we can actually make it much more of a meritocracy within organizations. And when I moved to London, people used to ask me to come and give talks in companies, particularly in financial services and big technology companies. And they would ask me to come and talk about the differences between outcomes in companies, very often between men and women, actually. And I would go to the firm and I would talk a lot about the type of research that I'd done. So the things that we can do when we're hiring, the things that you can do when you're promoting to make things fairer, how you can run meetings to make sure that people get equal opportunities, visibility and voice in meetings, all coming from research that we had done in firms. And what was really interesting in those talks is that, you know, I faced an audience like this, and very often you don't get a reaction until the end in the Q&A. And sometimes it's actually afterwards where people would come up to you for one-on-one. And a lot of people came up to me and they would say, well, actually, that was a decent talk, but there was nothing in it for me. You spoke a lot about what human resources can do in order to change the landscape within companies. You spoke a lot about what executives could do, but I'm new in my career, or I'm 2 years in my career, or I'm just interning. So what does it actually mean for me? Do I really have to wait for people who I can't relate to make changes so I can progress in the organization? And that happened, you know, it must have happened 10, 12 times. And I really took it seriously and thought about, okay, what I'm interested in looking at is a body of research and doing some research on my own about taking control of your own career, even when things aren't necessarily going your way. And that's where Think Big, Take Small Steps and Build the Future You Want was born. So it's really about a person at any level of their career, regardless of whether you're, you know, an undergraduate like most of you are today, or whether you're a little bit further along, or maybe you're even thinking about retiring and want to have some other opportunities after you retire from your main job. But what is it that you can actually control to keep you moving forward? So really written in a positive frame and leveraging behavioral science, which I'll also tell you a little bit more about. And when I started reading Thinking Big by Thinking Differently, I recalled some work that I did in an organization where, again, I faced young people like you who were coming into work in this very, very large organization. And I was asked to spend some time with them to learn about what their ambitions might be. So we asked them 2 questions, and I was given 10 minutes notice to put these questions together. And we asked them 2 questions. So the first question was, where do you see yourself in the future? And the second was, how long is it going to take you to get there? And for the first question, we got really detailed responses about the type of job a person would like to see themselves in, and very variable horizons for the second. But when I looked back on this research 10 years later, and I looked at people on LinkedIn and looked to see where they were, and we had permission to reach out to them, so we did just that, something really stark came into view. So the first was that there was really 2 groups of people. The first were the people who came into the company, trusting the company for their career progression, trusting that they would have a linear career progression, really aiming for the next promotion, really aiming for the next position, maybe to get a permanent job, really relying on the manager, really relying on the organization. And then the second were people who I would have said, when I read it 10 years ago, were incredibly imaginative. So they thought about themselves much further in the future, sometimes 10, 15 years in the future, and what they would actually be doing, and spoke about why they would actually like to do that. Some was for purpose, some was for status, some was for work-life balance, very variable reasons. But the thing that was interesting when you compare those people 10 years later is that, firstly, the first group were actually pretty accurate. So they did, you know, in the time frame that they described, mostly end up being in the position that they said that they would be in. The second group got it much more spectacularly wrong. However, they were happier, they were earning more money, and they had higher status and motivation if you think about self-reports and data. So even though they had thought big, they had got their goals spectacularly wrong because they'd moved in a direction of something that was much bigger than what they were when they were starting out. They managed to navigate to a place where they were happier. They managed to navigate to a place where they were more income secure. And they also managed to navigate to a place where they would say they're much more satisfied with their work today. Now, for me, I'm interested in getting people to think big. And what that means is thinking about what you would like to do in the future if there were no constraints on you. So I think society puts constraints on us, people around us put constraints on us, our geography puts constraints on us. But if you were to take all of that away, what would you end up doing? And I don't really want you to visualize a job title. I don't want you to visualize a position that you would have in a company, but rather I'd love you to visualize the tasks that you're doing on a day-to-day basis. So if I said to you, everything will work out in 10 years' time, what would you be doing when you show up on a Monday when it comes to tasks? And I like to get people to focus on tasks because I've taught in the LSE for 10 years now, and I've met incredibly bright people. But often when we talk about careers, people have a very poor idea about what the tasks are going to be within that particular job. So some part of thinking big, if you're sitting there saying, I can't even think about what I want to do next week, never mind in 10 years' time, is actually one, just being a bit more self-reflected about what you do enjoy doing. What is the content of your degree course that you are most engaged in? What are the activities that you're most excited about when they're on your curriculum? And if you were to look at people who are doing jobs, what are the tasks that you would think you would be the most excited about? And hopefully getting out and meeting some of those people and asking them about their jobs. And even if you're lucky, getting to shadow them. So you get to see, okay, that job sounds exciting, but are the tasks really what I expect them to be? Because one of the best navigators of our future is getting information. So the more information that you can get about the opportunities that are open to you now, about your tastes on the tasks, the more successful you're likely to be. Now, it sounds easy to think big. So I guess the big question is, what stops people thinking big? And very often people are posed by the constraints that are put on them by society, by a lack of information, and by some other things that I deal with in the book Think Big that I won't dwell on today. But ultimately what I'd like you to do, if you don't have an idea about your career right now, is make a commitment. Just do some self-reflection and think about what it is you fundamentally enjoy doing so that you then have a Think Big goal. So thinking big is all about the tasks of the job that you will do. It's not about the job title. The advantage of this is that you're much more likely to land in a job that will make you happy and not wake up when you're 30, 40 or 50 and say, I wish that I'd done something incredibly different, which if you follow the social science research, you'll know there's really good evidence that this is happening more often than we would like. But secondly, I study the fourth industrial revolution and how jobs are actually changing. And people who take a task-based approach to choosing their occupation rather than fixating on a job title tend to be much more adaptable and also are much more likely to move if the job that they're having becomes vulnerable because of the technology shocks. Now, before I talk about how you can actually achieve your Think Big goal, which is the bulk of my research and the bulk of my writing in Think Big, I want to introduce you briefly to behavioral science. So I did ask before the session whether or not there were some people from behavioral science here in the audience, and I'm not quite sure. But if you are, just please bear with me, because I want to give lesson 101 for anyone who's studying behavioral science at the LSE or elsewhere. I'm an economist, so my background is actually in economics. And if you study economics, one thing that you learn is, as we make decisions, we weigh up costs, benefits, and risk. So if you can imagine every decision that you're making, economists believe you make rational decisions and you weigh up the costs, benefits, and risk. So for anyone who's not studying economics in the audience, that's going to seem quite far-fetched. Because of all the decisions that you're making on a day-to-day basis, do you really think that you're fully weighing up the costs, benefits, and the risk? Well, behavioral scientists would say no. So Danny Kahneman, a Nobel laureate, he passed away recently, sadly, introduced the idea of thinking fast and slow, which is hinged on the idea of dual process theory. And it's really simple. It basically says human beings have two thinking styles. The first is very, very fast. You're on autopilot. You're unconscious. You're not necessarily registering your decisions. And the second is very, very slow, very, very deliberate. You're really concentrating extremely hard. So a question for you, and if you can just shout out a couple of answers. If we take percentages from 0 to 100%, how much time do you think you spend making decisions and thinking in system one, this fast, unconscious, where you're not necessarily processing your decisions in terms of costs, benefits, and risk? Annie? 20%? Yeah? Any others? 80? 60? 70? 72? That is fantastically specific. I really think that does apply to you. Any others? 90? So the research tells us that we spend somewhere between 80 and 95% of our time making decisions using our unconscious mind. So making decisions where we're fully not processing what we're actually buying into. So we're basically going around making decisions, not processing them, and hoping that it will all work out. Now, I don't want you to panic with this revelation, because there's really good evidence that once you learn by doing, so once you get to repeat a decision, so for example, if you like a particular cup of coffee in a coffee shop, you'll learn which coffee shop you like, and you won't make a mistake about going to a horrible coffee shop again. But when we think about big decisions that we have to make, like choosing your career, choosing where you'll end up in 10 years' time, it's really important that we don't rely on system one unless we have really good habits. And one thing that I would tell you for sure is that if you're not thinking about this in a very strategic way, society will choose your career for you. So you'll end up like that first group of students who go into the company and they kind of go along with whatever the company has decided their career is going to be. That might be really wonderful for some people in the room, but for others, I think the idea of going on an adventure that you choose yourself should be quite appealing. So I guess, what does this all mean for your future success? If we spend 80 to 95% of our time in system one, what does it mean with respect to pursuing a Think Big goal that I hope you all are now holding in your mind? So everybody in this room will know, if you've come through kind of, early education, one of the first things we learn is everyday small actions matter for life domains. So all of us brush our teeth, we make efforts to eat healthy, we make efforts to get lots of sleep. And even those people in the audience who mightn't do these things will know that it's not necessarily good for their health. I can see you're saying, no, I don't do that. We can talk after. So most people, we'll say 90% of people are aware of this, and most people do follow on, brushing teeth, trying to eat healthy, trying to get enough sleep. Very few people actually take small conscious actions to advance their future career weekly. So very often when we think about how people navigate into their careers, as I said, society tells them where they should go. They enter into an organization. They follow on the organization's path in a way, following their unconscious mind, very often trading off their health actually for doing well. When, if we step back and we take some conscious small actions to advance towards our future career, we can be making progress towards our weekly goal. So if you do rethink big, this is exactly what I'm going to ask you to do. To spend some time weekly, just like you do, paying attention to eating healthy, sleeping, brushing your teeth, to take small conscious actions that allow you to advance your weekly goal. And if you do this, you will be in a minority, because for most people, although they do brush their teeth, they do try to eat healthy, and they do get enough sleep, they don't consciously take actions that will shape their future career. So the answer is pretty much zero. And the reason they don't do this is kind of threefold. So first, unlike eating healthy, so when I eat healthy, I feel relatively good afterwards, the small actions that you take towards your future career need to be done in a consistent manner before you actually start seeing payoff. So actually, in the beginning, it can be a bit of a drag. So if you need to learn a new skill, if you're somebody who needs to start networking for the first time and you haven't necessarily networked before, then this is going to be pretty difficult for you. So people do quit. The second is time. So what has really struck me in my research, I think it's 98% now, the people I ask about whether or not they feel particularly busy in a week is at 98%. Slightly less for undergraduate students, but it still is a very, very large majority. So that means that people don't feel that they have time in their week in order to take small conscious actions towards their future career. Now, most of us will find time in our week to be there for a friend if they need us, and most of us will find time in a week to be there for our family, but by not finding time in our week to be there for our future career, we're essentially not finding time for our future self. So our future self is the person who you're going to meet in 5 years and 10 years' time, 20 years' time, 30 years' time, and I think it's important that you invest in them to make sure that they're happy and financially secure. So again, what I'm asking you to do today is to pay attention to how you're spending your time weekly and hopefully make time for this future self. And I'm not asking for much. I'm asking for a 90-minute weekly commitment. The time is rooted in research for two things. One, on effectiveness, and two, it's exactly the place where you'll find flow. So what flow means is it's the place where you'll be able to get into deep learning if you have to learn a new skill. So if you can commit 90 minutes a week, that's fantastic. If you can't, you're probably still saying that you don't have enough time. So I'm going to ask you to do a time audit and write down all of the things that you spend your time doing. And usually you'll find that these things fall into 3 different buckets. So the first are the things that make you happy in the moment. So they give you happiness, they give you joy. The second are the things where you're investing in your future self, or your future family, or your future friends. So there's no payoff now, but there's a payoff in the future. These are the things we find hard to show up for. It's called time and consistent preferences in research if you're interested. But the third are what I call the time sinkers, where they don't give you any joy, they don't give anyone else any joy, and they really are a waste of your time. And usually, when people do time audits, they figure out that they have significant investment in time sinkers, which includes spending too much time on social media, spending too much time online in general, spending too much time on email, and spending too much time on busy work. So going to meetings, going to other gatherings that aren't giving you any value or anyone else in that moment. And in Think Big, I make the argument that we need to cut out our time sinkers and really get smart about our time. So we need to make sure that we're spending our time either bringing us joy in the moment or paying attention to our future self to make sure that they'll also have joy. In Think Big, I also talk a lot about bias, so the type of biases that hold people back in their careers in particular. And the reason I do this is because I'm really interested in System 1, this time that we spend 80 to 95% of our time in unconscious mode. And I'm particularly interested in the biases that have been identified that actually hold people back in their career. So for a few minutes, I just want us to think about the different types of internal bias that you might want to fight if you want to make sure that you are successful and happy in the future. So if you look at the research, I've already spoken about two different groups of people at the beginning of the lecture, and I mentioned that the first group of people were really thinking about the path that was given to them in their organization. They were really attached to linear career paths, this idea that you move up in an organization and the organization takes care of the career path. The reality for people who are successful is that it's a non-linear career path. There will be ups and downs, and it's really important that you recognize that when you're having a down, it's just part of the journey. The journey hasn't ended. For anybody who's going to be ambitious and who's going to pursue a job that will bring them joy, there certainly are going to be times that things aren't going to be going their way, and that's because they're going to be putting their hat in the ring much more than other types of people, and they're going to be failing more. So resilience becomes really important. The second thing that's been identified is the spotlight effect. So very often what holds people back from being successful is that they're afraid that they're going to be in the spotlight. They're afraid that if they put themselves out there and ask for a favor, they'll be told no, and the rejection is really going to hurt them. Or they're afraid that if they stand on a stage like I'm doing today and give a talk and it doesn't go so well, that people are going to remember it forever, and that's the thing that's going to be imprinted on their CV. And the reality is, for the majority of us, this doesn't happen. So the spotlight effect is our belief that people are always looking at us, thinking about us, and when we do something wrong, it's playing on their mind. The reality, which is really freeing, is that most people aren't thinking about us at all. In fact, they're so busy in their own heads thinking about themselves that if something negative happens to you today, they're unlikely to remember it. Quite depressing if you think about the imprint that you might be having on a moment-to-moment basis, but quite freeing if you think about putting yourself out there. So if there's something that you want to do that's holding you back because you have a fear of failure, please do remember the spotlight effect and just put your hat in the ring, safe in the knowledge that if it doesn't work out, you'll be given another try, and if it doesn't work out, people won't be remembering it for you. The next bias that I want to talk about is confirmation bias. So most of you here in the room are aware of the polarization that's in society today, and part of this is driven by confirmation bias, where as individuals we have a particular view on something and we seek out evidence that actually confirms our view. It's exactly the same when it comes to careers. So the reason that we don't expand our knowledge about the different types of careers that are available to us and the different types of tasks that are available to us is that we have a particular idea about the journey we should take, and we just seek out information that actually confirms that. So again, for me, one of the biggest gifts that I've actually given myself is having people around me who are incredibly diverse in background, in discipline, and in the perspective that they bring. And when I need to move my career forward, I ask them for advice. Now, you're at a wonderfully exciting part of your journey where you're just starting out. So now is the time to really invest in those relationships that you have, not just inside in the class, but paying attention to people who you can get to know, who can give you advice in your career, focusing on getting diverse perspectives. And the last thing that I'll talk about is resilience. So I devote an entire chapter in Think Big to resilience and really paying attention to how we as individuals can actually hone our resilience in order to make sure that we keep moving along in our career in the way that we would actually want to. I think what's really interesting in society today is that the fear of failure has gone up. The perception that we have lower levels of resilience has gone up, and the tendency to actually hone resilience reserves, we can improve our resilience reserves at any time, has also gone down. In Think Big, I talk about resilience when it comes to day-to-day issues. So failing an exam, being insulted by somebody, not doing as well as you thought you would in a task that you actually had to do. So really these things that we actually pay attention to on a day-to-day basis. For these big moments in life, bereavements, and other things that you might be interested in, there's much better writings than what I have. And what I also pay attention to are what are the lessons from behavioral scientists that allow us not just preserve our resilience reserves, but also allow us improve them. So there's two things that I want to flag to you today that are really helpful. So the first is pay attention to who you compare yourself to. So the literature is really clear that if you're somebody who's comparing yourself to your peers, comparing yourself to how somebody is doing on social media, or comparing yourself to somebody else who you see outside yourself, you're going to have much lower levels of resilience reserves, and you're also going to have a much faster emotional roller coaster. In contrast, people who focus on improving themselves, even if it's incremental on a day-to-day basis, in very, very small amounts, comparing themselves to themselves 1 week later, 1 month later, and 1 year later, are not just more resilient, are also happier and much more secure in their career. The second part about resilience that's dealt with in behavioral science is paying attention to loss aversion. So loss aversion is a bias where we as individuals pay much more attention to negative things that happen to us on a day-to-day basis as compared to positive things. So what that means is that if I'm insulted by you today, it's going to weigh much heavier on me as compared to if one of you give me a compliment that's just as strong. Or if I go into a room in a meeting and I'm interrupted, I'm going to pay much more attention to that interruption as compared to the moments where I have voice. So human beings are hardwired to zone in on losses and to ignore the wins that they have in the day. So the behavioral science literature suggests that we really need to pay attention to loss aversion and refocus ourselves to think about what are the things that are actually going right to us. Now, a lot of people will talk about journaling, which I think if you're in the audience and you're a journaler, that's a fantastic thing to do, to write down what are the things that have gone right to you every single day. If you're not, you can simply put an alarm on your phone at 6 p.m., 9 p.m., and just take 1 minute to recall all the things that actually went right. And if you think about a negative thought, to push it away. Now, this literature in behavioral science on resilience lines up really nicely with a literature on gratitude. So there's very few things that I can tell you with certainty that will make you happy. And the reason that I will say that is that there's false confidence in the samples that we have in the happiness literature, and different things tend to make different people happy. The one thing that seems to be incredibly robust is gratitude. So if things are going right for you, do call them into your mind and make sure that you put some focus on them. And the last thing that I want to say before we go to questions is really do pay attention to your happiness on a particular day. There's a really cool study that talks about people's happiness as they go through life, emphasizing that we're born pretty happy, and as we go through early childhood, we remain pretty happy. Teenage years, it takes a bit of a dive, and the next dive it takes is when you actually go into the labor force. And it doesn't rebound until you hit around 80 years of age on average, which is tough luck for men because it's just over their average life expectancy. But the reason I say this is because I kind of started by talking about focusing on you're all going to university. I started by focusing on asking you to think big, choosing tasks that you would enjoy doing so you can invest your time making sure that you have a job with tasks that you enjoy doing. If you do decide to be in the workforce, particularly if you decide to work full-time, it's really important that you find a job that doesn't just give you financial security, but it also gives you joy. You're going to spend an incredible amount of time in that job. If you look at the social science research again, it emphasizes that the closest colleague that you will have in the workplace, you're going to spend more time with them than your spouse. So choosing your job correctly is really, really important for your happiness. And also choosing the people who are working around you is really, really important for your happiness. So I'll leave it with that, and I'm hoping that you as a cohort will be somebody who I'll revisit in 10 years' time and see this dismal social science statistic taking a U-turn. Thank you for listening.
Okay. Thanks so much, Grace, for that fascinating talk and sort of journey through Think Big. I think what's really incredibly powerful about Grace's talk is that there's a wealth of research that sits behind every single insight about thinking big, taking small steps and building the future you want, underpinning every single insight. And so I'm going to open up the floor. And so, sorry to say, and so that gives you a sense of how you might want to take your own research and think about the type of career you might want to pursue. Do you want to stay in research at all? Are you interested in staying more in a pure research domain, or are you interested in moving into something which has much more immediate applied application? So I'd like to invite questions from the floor about Grace's presentation. I'm going to take 3, and we've got 2 colleagues with roving mics, and we'll take 3 at a time. We've got 1 here at the front, and then 1 up there in the middle, and then a 3rd one in the back row. So maybe we'll start here.
Yeah,
you want to introduce yourself as well, just so we know where you come from?
Yeah, of course. So, hi, I'm Neve. I'm actually a staff member. I'm here with some students from NCUC, just over there. Woo! To NCUC, which is Newcastle College University Centre. My question was actually about, again, I guess kind of related to our context. So, a lot of our students are mature students. I think we have a higher proportion of mature students than most universities. So, they are students that have woken up at 30, 40, 50 and gone, oh no, I don't like my job, I want to change. So for them particularly, is there anything that you would recommend that's maybe different in this think big model than would be for the typical university student that's coming in at 18?
Great. Do you want to answer immediately? Are you happy with that?
Yeah, is that okay? Yeah. Well, first, I think good. I mean, I think it's amazing. I myself did a master's degree when I was in my late 30s, so I think it's absolutely fantastic to go back and get skills. So that's, I guess, the first thing when it comes to think big is thinking about what are you willing to invest in your future self, and it always gets harder as we get older. So the more people who we can actually retrain, yes, we should be going back and retraining, the better. But I think the recipe is the same. So even though you're studying for a degree as a mature student, think about what could you be just doing for 90 minutes a week in order to guarantee your success. And there's a really cool literature on luck for anybody who's looking for a research topic that asks people who are very successful about how they ended up being very successful, and successful in two terms, both in terms of generating income, but also in terms of being in the happiest jobs. And what's really interesting about these people is that they'll often say, well, I was in the right place at the right time, or I got lucky. But actually, if you trace back what gave them that moment of consideration, it was somebody who they met, who was in their network, who spotted an opportunity for them and made the link at the right moment. So the one advice that I would actually give to everybody, particularly if you've made the decision to really reinvest, is work on your networks for those 90 minutes and make sure you're connecting with people who say, oh yes, Claire would be wonderful for this opportunity, Grace would be wonderful for this opportunity, let's make that connection. So 90 minutes networking. As somebody who hates networking and I find it really uncomfortable, the best tip that I was given, which I still use, is arrive early, because then you don't have to have that awkward moment where you introduce yourself. The first person who comes into the room will actually speak to you, so that's taken away. And then invest in following up on those relationships.
Thank you. Question in the middle there, the back.
Hi, my name is Shazib. I'm from Leeds. So the question was, like, does the act of thinking big and like the self-reflection on future goals really apply for students or like people in general who are like struggling to make ends meet, and like, because in some cases responsibilities, or in some cases just even survival, have like more of an immediate and a short-term impact on occupancy on their mind? And if not, then do you believe like notions like thinking big, self-reflection are somewhat classist?
Well, firstly, just on the networking point, we're going to be in Leeds in June, so I'd love to connect if you're interested in doing more networking, and you can come along and meet some people. But I don't think so. I think I come from a working class background myself. The most important, the reason that I'm sitting here as a professor at the London School of Economics is actually because I did some of the things that I recommend in Think Big, which includes taking 90 minutes weekly to move along my career. I think if you're somebody who is under financial distress, I've been there, so you absolutely have my empathy. But finding those 90 minutes to make a connection who might be able to give you more work in the future, or even in the immediate, who might be able to give you that key reference, really making sure that you're investing in your skills so that you'll be able to go to the labour market and get a job that pays a higher wage becomes even more important. So again, for most people who are struggling, it can feel that finding those 90 minutes becomes really difficult. But if you do the time audit, I'm certain you'll be able to find them. And that consistent commitment works. And the reason it works is because so few people do it, regardless of the class that they're living in society, because they feel busy.
Thank you. There's a question at the back, right in the back row.
Hi, I'm Lucy. I'm from the University of Sussex. And aside from my university work as a microbiologist, I'm also a key organiser for the disability community and sort of a disability advocate. And a lot of the things you were talking about make me think about sort of neurodivergence. As a neurodivergent person myself, and someone who works with a lot of neurodivergent people, they sort of make me think of these common, say, like CBT thinking errors. And have you noticed is there a difference in using these types of techniques in neurodivergent people, so say autistic, ADHD, OCD, etc.? For example, a lot of the things talking about are like symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder, the sort of negative sides. Is that something you've noticed of sort of differences in outcomes for neurodivergent people compared to non-neurodivergent people?
So the evidence I have on the differences is anecdotal, in the sense it's based on people who I know who have tried them and who have reported back to me. And there's two things that I think are different. So the first are the activities that people who are neurodiverse tend to be different compared to other people who bring on Think Big, but nonetheless it still moves people forward. The second as well is kind of around the consistency part. So some weeks it's less than 90 minutes, some weeks it's more. But again, it's kind of reminding yourself that once you're actually doing something and moving forward, it becomes, once you're doing something and moving forward, the consistency ultimately builds up. We do have a project at the moment called 200 Diverse Voices, which has a relatively large sample of people who are neurodiverse. So again, we're hoping to get more insights for that so we can have more tailored recommendations. I think the one thing in Think Big, which is different from any type of book which will be classed under self-help, a heading that I don't particularly love, is that I really stress that the tips that I give may work for you, and it's really important that you evaluate their success. And I would say that my colleagues and friends who are neurodiverse, different things work for them, and just actually going through the experiment, just like everybody else, is something that they found to be worthwhile.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to ask a question? There's a question over there on the left, please.
Hi, that was really interesting. Thank you. I guess I just wanted to pick up on the last 2 points. And I guess, so what the impression I'm getting from your talk is that you've laid out this kind of very individualistic framework, right? You've kind of pointed out that there are certain things that individuals can do to make their the chance of employability greater. However, I guess I'd be interested to see how you kind of reconcile that with the other work that you pointed out that you do about favoritism in the corporate workplace. And I guess I'm thinking about this situation and scenario in which someone might do all of these things, but because of systemic factors outside of their control, they don't get the job that they want. But because they follow this framework and they've kind of believed this idea that, you know, the actions they do and the things that they do in the workplace will get them to a point of success. I feel like that could lead to a great deal of disappointment, which is not necessarily to say it's a problem with the framework, but a problem with the systems surrounding it. And I guess I wonder if in the book you make recourse to those kind of systemic barriers which get in people's way, which may lead to disappointment when taking an individualistic framework like this.
Yes, so kind of two things. So the short answer is yes. So chapter 4 is dedicated to external biases that people actually face, including the systemic ones that you describe, and also some random external biases that people face, and how they can actually move around them. I will really be incredibly honest with you and say that when I wrote the book and I submitted it to the publishers, they actually said to me, your chapter 4 needs to be much more optimistic. And we had this row, and you'll read it, and it's really written in the reality of the world that we live in, that talks about actually, yes, there are some people who will come up against systematic barriers, and the best thing that I can do in the moment is to equip them with what they can actually do when that happens. I think the second thing to say is, when I started out, and I kind of mentioned this in the beginning, I really focused on what firms and managers can actually do to level the playing field and to create a meritocracy. And I can say that a lot of firms are doing much better than they were 10 years ago. Some firms are still doing terribly and paying lip service to change. So you have these two types. But all of my work, if I was to criticize my earlier work, I would say I'm putting in the hands of somebody else the power to decide whether or not the system will actually change. And when I wrote Think Big, what I really want to do is put the power in the individual to battle the system even when the system is actually against them. And there's two parts of that. One, which we didn't cover today, fighting external biases. And the second is taking control of the things that you can actually control in the moment. And for me, that's really important. And I'd never looked at my old work through that lens before, but it's when I kind of started writing the book, I started thinking, actually, I'd be really irritated if I'm in a company where the chips are really stacked against me because of favoritism and because of discrimination. And here I am battling, waiting for a change, and somebody comes in and says, well, this is what the firm can do, and they're still not choosing to do it. So here I really just try to empower people. And my hope is that, because I did set up the Inclusion Initiative, that we end up with diverse people who are in organizations who haven't adapted to the system, and when they make it to the end of the finish line, they create change so the people coming behind them don't have to deal with it.
Thank you. We have time for a couple more questions. There's a person in the middle, or to the right.
Hi, I'm Anya. I'm from Nottingham Trent University. Our compulsive education system has a really large emphasis on trying to achieve the best you can in all of your classes and to focus all of your energy into that, and that when you don't do those activities and you choose to do other things in your own time, any kind of negative connotations in your education is seen negative overall. Can you think of any changes to our education system which would help to incorporate this into younger minds so that you don't always start with that idea of pleasing an institution you're in over doing something individual that would help you, even if it's parallel or separate from the institution?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing, your question is fantastic. The first thing I'd say is that the system is wrong. We did some work here at the LSE where in a number of secondary schools, we put an evidence-based curriculum into the PSHE education that would teach people skills that we know are valuable in the fourth industrial revolution, like creativity, being adaptable, bringing their future self forward so that they get kind of this vision of who they're going to be and what the investment actually means, and also helping people to actually find what they love doing. So I think the rigidity of the system is entirely problematic. And when I was on the Skills and Productivity Board, the government know this, and why they're not changing it, I really don't have a good answer. So for me, as soon as you're really young, I'd love to see skills like creativity, adaptability, learning what your actual preferences are rather than having them imposed by you by a system or a structure, to come into education, and for that to follow all the way through, all the way up to secondary school. And then I think when people hit university, what they really need to learn is, how can I actually be an inclusive leader or an inclusive individual? And what that means is, how can I sit with ideas that are different to myself, feel uncomfortable in that particular moment, try and see the person's perspective, and be able to come up with a counter argument so I can become a better leader in my organization. Or go into a room where you're with team members, hear all their different diverse perspectives, and join the dots of those ideas so that you actually have a better idea. And these skills we're just not giving in the education system. So what people call soft skills, I call core skills in primary, secondary school, and then inclusive leadership, where the person isn't just becoming an inclusive leader for the society or their team, which is what I would want, but also they're getting the gains as an individual, because that's a skill that AI won't be able to replicate. Being able to have a human brain sitting in a room, hearing different ideas and putting them together in a way that hasn't been done in the past is definitely something that artificial intelligence can't do, and people just aren't getting those skills. And that includes me. So regardless of what life stage you're at, those skills are just not there on the market easily.
Well, so I think we're coming to the end of the session, so I'm going to momentarily thank Grace, but please don't run away immediately because I've got a couple of announcements. So Grace, thank you for that really inspiring talk. I hope everybody's taken away at least one thing that they might try out, knowing that it comes from this sort of rich evidence-based research. And I think I want to thank everybody for really good, powerful questions, thinking in particular about the balance between those external structural factors and then the sort of agency that we can grow in ourselves to try and make change happen. So this is the book if you want to find out more. I'm sure there are also some fantastic YouTube clips of you, Grace, or on your website. So can we have a round of applause for Grace, and then